It's happened again. The hate crimes unit investigates a brutal beating.
The 75-year-old woman says she was attacked unprovoked.
Stomping on her several times before police say he made anti-Asian statements.
He is now in serious condition and was in critical when paramedics first rushed him to the hospital.
Since the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, anti-Asian hate crimes spiked 150%. According to the Stop AAPI Hate National Report, nearly 6,600 incidents were reported in the past year, with verbal harassment making up 65.2% of the reported incidents and physical assault making up 12.6%. While it may seem that the rhetoric of Donald Trump and his constituents caused this increase in anti-Asian violence,
the Chinese virus, Kung Flu,
the truth is, this violence has been a part of America's history for years. People of Asian descent have resided in the U.S. since the 1800s and have been the targets of racism and scapegoating for decades. To understand the violence happening today, one must first understand the dark history behind it. Historical records indicate early Asian immigration in the late 18th century, predominantly in Hawaii. When Western traders arrived on the islands, they brought along Chinese sailors who began settling in Hawaii in 1789. These early Chinese settlers intermarried with Hawaiian women and assimilated into Hawaiian culture, which continued into the 19th century. The first major wave of Asian immigration occurred in the 1850s, following Hawaii's booming sugarcane industry and the California gold rush. In Hawaii, white plantation owners imported numerous workers from Asia and around the world as sources of cheap labor to work on sugarcane plantations. Most were Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Puerto Rican, and Portuguese, but the initial recruits came from China. By 1851, more than 20,000 Chinese immigrants moved out to California during the gold rush in pursuit of the American dream. At the time, there were large waves of Irish, German, and Chinese immigration, but Chinese immigrants were regarded as a bigger threat. With that came the narrative of the Yellow Peril, depicting them as perpetual foreign invaders disrupting Western culture. The 1854 People v. Hall case set the stage for a future of threats to Asians' civil rights. George Hall, a white man, had been convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of a Chinese miner named Ling Sing. Despite 3 Chinese witnesses testifying to the killing, the California Supreme Court ruled that people of Asian descent had no rights to testify against white citizens. It was a ruling that grouped Asian people with Native and African Americans as lacking status to testify against European Americans in court, essentially guaranteeing that white people could escape punishment for anti-Asian violence. After the gold rush, Chinese immigrants were seen as cheap labor, willingly filling the demand for low-wage paying jobs. During the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s, Chinese railroad workers toiled in grueling conditions for low pay, and hundreds died from explosions, accidents, and disease. Even though Chinese immigrants played a crucial role in the railroad's construction, their contributions were largely discredited by white historians. Many Chinese workers moved into California's surrounding cities and began to compete in the labor force with white workers. The ongoing belief that Chinese immigrants held a lesser social status than their white peers, along with the resentment against them accepting lower wages and thus taking jobs away from white workers, soon transformed into complete racial hostility. Chinese immigrants also endured an epidemic of violent racist attacks while receiving very little help from the law. One of the most infamous incidents was the Chinese Massacre of 1871. On October 24th, a dispute between 2 Chinese rivals over ownership rights to a female prostitute resulted in the accidental shooting of a white man. Fueled by the incident and ongoing racial tension, a mob of 500 locals shot, hung, and stabbed innocent Chinese residents in the surrounding neighborhood, resulting in 19 deaths. In 1872, only 9 rioters were convicted of manslaughter, but the California Supreme Court overruled the decision in April 1873. Hostility only increased towards Chinese immigrants after an economic depression hit in the 1870s. Even though most of the immigrants coming to America at the time were not Chinese, the Chinese were still singled out as the cause of the country's high unemployment rates. The first restrictive federal immigration law was the Page Act of 1875, targeting East Asian women. On paper, it was an anti-prostitution measure. In practice, it banned nearly all East Asian women from immigrating to the U.S. due to the hypersexualization of Chinese women at the time and the assumption that most were prostitutes. And in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all Chinese immigration to the United States. The act declared Chinese immigrants residing in the U.S. and their American-born families ineligible to gain citizenship. It also required them to carry residence documentation under penalty of hard labor and even deportation. When the Exclusion Act expired, Congress extended it for another 10 years. The decrease in Chinese immigration led employers to seek out new sources of cheap labor. To maintain profitability of the Hawaii sugarcane industry, plantation owners turned to Japan. Between 1885 and 1895, nearly 29,000 Japanese immigrants arrived to work on Hawaii sugar plantations. And by the early 1900s, Asian immigration further diversified with significant waves of Korean, Filipino, and Indian immigration. Inevitably, the increase of Asian immigration led to more animosity. Anti-Asian hysteria was rampant in the early 1900s. In 1905, a group of white labor leaders and European immigrants launched the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League, which was later renamed the Asiatic Exclusion League to include the exclusion of South Asians. Their goal? To stop all Asian immigration and to disrupt the lives of Asians already residing in the U.S. Despite the opposition to the importation of Asian labor in the U.S., the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association, or HSPA, advocated for it. Hawaii's sugar industry exploited Asian immigrant labor, with the HSPA playing a large role by practicing paternalistic management and enforcing strict regulations to ensure obedience from their workers. From back-breaking work, deplorable pay, and primitive living conditions, plantation owners controlled workers' lives.
One strategy that sugar planters used was what they called a divide and control strategy. You would have workers of one particular ethnic group coming with the knowledge that eventually they might move off the plantation. Another group would be brought in, and of course, the newest arrivals were paid less than the older workers. So the sugar planters really wanted to pit one working group against another group so that they wouldn't organize collectively as a larger group.
Yet ongoing cycles of ignoring workers' pleas for higher wages and lenient workdays eventually led to strikes. And strikes eventually led to solidarity. Early strikes often consisted of ethnic unions striking alone, but in 1920, the Oahu Sugar Strike marked a significant turn when the Japanese Federation of Labor and the Filipino Federation of Labor both struck concurrently, but was eventually called off due to an ongoing flu epidemic. When World War II came along, labor strikes became legal and weren't successful, but the International Longshore and Warehouse Union would change that.
Even though it is actually illegal for the workers to go on strike, that doesn't stop the ILWU from boosting its membership. In September in 1946, around about Labor Day, you actually have the Great Sugar Strike of 1946. It was a very, very long strike. It was 79 days. 33 out of 34 plantations on all of the major islands were shut down. The strike really scared the living daylights out of the planters because how effective it was. It's remembered quite often because it really shows the ways in which people, regardless of their racial or ethnic background, if they organize effectively, if they organize in large numbers, as workers along the lines of class, they can be very, very effective.
There's a stereotype that Asian Americans are submissive and quiet and unheard, but I don't think that's necessarily true. It's just a question of who do you think is the audience, who are the listeners, who are the ones saying we're unheard. And I think throughout Asian American history, we have stood up for our rights, we have spoken out, and we have been heard.
In 1968, student activists Emma Gee and Yuji Ichioka formed the Asian American Political Alliance at the University of California, Berkeley, to increase the visibility of activists of Asian descent after being inspired by Black Power and other movements led by people of color. As a result, the term Asian American was coined, a term that would unite people of the Asian diaspora to fight for greater equality. The AAPI united with Black and Latinx groups to form the Third World Liberation Front to protest the Eurocentric curriculum and lack of diversity in universities.
The Asian American movement has made several gains. The first key one was the establishment of ethnic studies at San Francisco State. The strike at San Francisco State then spurred a strike at UC Berkeley. UCLA also had student protests. The Asian American Political Alliance, along with the Third World Liberation Front and the Black Student Union, created the first College of Ethnic Studies, and that pretty much revolutionized university education. It created an education that was relevant for communities of color, that fought for social change. The notions of community service learning or community-based participatory research all came out of ethnic studies.
Even though the AAPA dissolved following the strikes, Asian American unity didn't. Nearly 10 years later, the murder of a Chinese-American man named Vincent Chin sparked a new wave in Pan-Asian activism. During the 1980s, Asians were once again blamed for taking away jobs, but Japan's auto industry was the scapegoat this time. On June 19, 1982, Vincent Chin was beaten to death by two white auto workers in Detroit. Michael Nitz, who was recently laid off, and Ronald Ebbins assumed Chin was Japanese, blaming him for the unemployment in the American auto industry. Ebbins and Nitz were both found guilty of manslaughter, but only had to pay a $3,000 fine with 3 years probation. Asian American lawyers and community leaders came together to create American Citizens for Justice, a grassroots organization that rallied with churches, synagogues, and Black activists to protest the sentencing. This inspired Asian Americans nationwide to hold their own demonstrations, resulting in the first federal civil rights trial for an Asian American. In 1984, Ebbins was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but appealed and received a retrial in 1987 that cleared him of all charges. In the end, both Ebbins and Nitz settled a civil suit out of court, but received no jail time. Despite decades of vocal outcry, systematic racism continued to affect Asian Americans. However, we've seen racism manifest in deplorable ways when America faced crises in particular. Wars, terrorism, and public emergencies are prime examples of this.
When people are anxious, they will do all sorts of things that can be impulsive, rash, irrational. And when you're anxious, you will act out in all sorts of ways to try to comfort yourself. And that is where fear and racism intertwine, because it is about really blaming outsiders.
Take Japanese internment during World War II, for instance. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, local officials immediately took action to remove or incarcerate Japanese Americans without any evidence of involvement.
Our West Coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores.
President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 to relocate Japanese Americans to internment camps, affecting the lives of nearly 120,000 people, many of whom were native-born American citizens. Internment was officially lifted on December 17, 1944, but upon returning, many were met with hostility and struggled finding work again. Many faced housing injustice after losing property and finding their homes vandalized. At the time, the government offered no assistance to Japanese Americans who tried to rebuild their lives. Only in 1988 did the Japanese community receive an overdue presidential apology and $20,000 each in reparations, but nothing would repair the damage and trauma that was already inflicted. And in 2001, after 9/11, there was a drastic increase in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate crimes. Muslims residing in the U.S. and those perceived to be Muslim, particularly South Asians, were targeted. 4 days following the attacks, Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh American gas station owner, was shot and killed after being mistaken for Muslim due to his turban. Later on, white supremacist Mark Anthony Stroman went on a shooting spree in revenge for 9/11, killing Waqar Hassan, a Pakistani immigrant, and Vasudev Patel, a Hindu Indian immigrant, both whom he believed to be Arab. Even though the number of incidents dropped years after, they never returned to the low levels reported prior to the attacks. Reactions to public health emergencies have also shown significant spikes in racism when associating an illness with the entire countries or populations of people. For the Asian American community, COVID-19 isn't the first outbreak that led to a spike in racism and anti-Asian sentiment. Dating back to 1900, San Francisco was the first U.S. city hit by the bubonic plague, with the first case recorded in Chinatown. Pre-existing prejudices and stereotypes drove San Francisco's public policy, as Chinatown had already been criticized for its unhealthy aspects. Chinatown was immediately quarantined, preventing nearly 35,000 Chinese residents from leaving and anything from entering the area. Residents were unable to get to their jobs, and Chinatown businesses faced a loss of income. And the extension of Chinatown's quarantine was motivated more by racist depictions of Chinese Americans as carriers of the disease than by actual evidence of the plague's presence. And in 2003, anti-Asian resentment was on the rise again with the SARS outbreak.
Severe acute respiratory syndrome. And as new cases emerge, quarantines expand, and the disease spreads to North America, the consequences are multiplying.
An outbreak never actually occurred in the U.S., but fear and uncertainty led to stigmatization towards Asians since the virus originated in China.
During the SARS epidemic, I was a young child and a student in an elementary school in Long Island. The town that I lived in Long Island wasn't really one of the most racially diverse, but I remember that one time I was at school, I was running up to my classmates who were my best friends at the time, and as I was running up to them, my two friends, they yelled, "No, stay away from us, you have SARS," and they actually ran away from me. I didn't realize that the butt of the joke was that I must have had SARS because I'm Asian. At the time, it was something that I was blissfully ignorant and unaware that someone that I cared about, that two people that I cared about, had said such a hurtful and cruel and racist thing to me.
History repeated itself nearly 20 years later with the COVID-19 pandemic. Anti-Asian hate crimes surged, and these incidents continue to increase at an alarming rate.
In March 2020, I helped co-found Stop AAPI Hate, which is a reporting site, and we immediately got hundreds of responses from seniors, from limited English-speaking people across the nation, describing their horrific accounts of racism. It's a clear case of racial profiling. If you just happen to look Chinese, you could be attacked. So 60% of our respondents are non-Chinese. A Latino in LA was punched and told to go back to China. An indigenous person in Vancouver was shoved and told to go back to China. And it just shows that Asian Americans are seen as perpetual foreigners.
It's been very problematic to have had a president overtly and blatantly use the term China virus to refer to COVID-19 and to defend this terminology. The World Health Organization has explicitly instructed countries not to name any disease that refers to a geographical location, animal, individual, group, or people because of the scapegoating. We know historically that we automatically racialize infectious disease. I mean, we've seen that with SARS, we saw that with Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, the swine flu. It's racism and xenophobia because of the anti-immigrant, anti-outsider attitude of, outsiders, foreigners are dirty. They bring disease in. Trump's inflammatory COVID language not only confirms stereotypes, but he role modeled that you can be racist and xenophobic, and he showcased too that you can incite this kind of language and violence without consequences. There's so much research that has shown the detrimental impact of racism on people's mental health, on people's physical health. For Asian Americans in particular, not only does it cripple your mental health, it also cripples or it devastates your identity, your sense of self-worth, your value, your belonging, and it's at the individual level and at the community level. I mean, this is why, hate crimes have the added severity to it, because the impact is not just at the individual level. A hate crime hurts and devastates an entire community. Even after we no longer have to quarantine, shelter in place, or socially distance, people will continue to be scared to go out. It will not be because of COVID-19. It will be because of the virus of racism.
But there's also been progress. This violence sparked a major wave in AAPI activism nationwide. And in a country where Asian Americans have felt invisible and left out of the conversation, many public figures and political leaders have also spoken out condemning this violence. On April 22nd, the Senate passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act with a wide bipartisan majority. Under this new bill, the Department of Justice will facilitate an expedited review of reported hate crimes, as well as issuing guidance on raising awareness, such as expanding public education campaigns. Even with new legislation and increasing activism, what else still needs to be done?
How do you share your story and help people care about your concerns, right? And I think we have to change people's minds, right? And that's why we have data, that's why we're collecting stories, but you also have to change people's hearts. I think ethnic studies humanizes people. It shows that all of us have stories, all of us have histories, all of us have creative expressions that enrich us. Gaining representation is really critical. So it's important for us to lift up our voice, to go on social media, but it was really important for Asian Americans to have voted last year. We voted in droves, and 63% of Asian Americans said racism was their motivating factor to vote. It's representation to gain concrete changes in the funding for Asian Americans and the attention that Asian Americans get for their real needs. The Asian American movement that started in the 60s has continued today and has resulted in the Stop AAPI Hate movement. We actually have already inherited that legacy, and I see ourselves continuing it.
To stop Asian hate is to also include us. The model minority myth makes it so that they don't have to include us. They think that it's all good. And that is why until we have a system that is made in our image, we are here to dismantle theirs. And just one more time, you are loved. You deserve to be here. You deserve to have your voices heard. That's it.